The moment the headlines collided like thunder across television screens and mobile phones, federal agents arresting journalist Don Lemon while President Trump launched a blistering attack on Alex Prediti, it felt less like ordinary breaking news and more like the opening act of a political storm where power, media, and justice crashed into one another with unstoppable force as flashing lights cut through the night. Like this Vide and subscribe my channel, thanks. Continue Full Watch video agents move swiftly with practiced precision, and the air itself seemed heavy with the realization that this was not just another arrest, but a moment that would echo across the national conversation, igniting debates about press freedom, political retaliation, and the fragile line between law enforcement and narrative warfare. Like, inside the unfolding drama, sources describe Don Lemon's arrest as methodical yet shocking, with federal agents appearing suddenly, their presence instantly transforming an ordinary moment into a spectacle of authority and consequence. While Lemon, long accustomed to questioning power from behind a news desk, now stood face to face with it, experiencing firsthand the cold reality of being the subject of a federal action rather than the voice explaining one, his expression reportedly revealing a complex blend of disbelief, composure, and instinctive awareness that this moment would travel far beyond the room, becoming a symbol, a headline, and a battleground for competing political interpretations. Almost simultaneously, President Trump's public attack on Alex Prediti poured gasoline on an already raging fire, his words sharp, calculated, and unmistakably aimed at reshaping the narrative, framing the moment not merely as a legal matter, but as part of a broader conflict between his administration and figures he has long criticized, and as his remarks spread across media platforms, they amplified the emotional intensity of the story, transforming what could have been a procedural arrest into a political flashpoint, where supporters saw law and order being enforced, while critics perceived intimidation and retaliation against journalists who dared challenge authority. Behind the scenes, newsroom producers scrambled, phones rang endlessly, and editors rushed to confirm facts while knowing that speed would shape perception long before full clarity could emerge, illustrating the brutal reality of modern news cycles where the first narrative often becomes the dominant one, regardless of later corrections. And within minutes, the story had fractured into multiple interpretations, some framing Lemon as a journalist targeted for doing his job, others portraying him as someone who crossed legal boundaries under the cover of reporting, each version racing across social media like wildfire, feeding outrage, disbelief, and emotional investment from millions of viewers. Analysts began piecing together the legal framework behind the charges, explaining that federal law related to disruptions of protected spaces such as places of worship carries serious consequences. Yet the deeper controversy lay in whether Lemon's presence and actions constituted participation or mere documentation, a distinction that sits at the heart of press freedom debates, and one that has historically shaped landmark legal battles over the rights of journalists to observe, record, and report without fear of criminal punishment, making this case not just about one man, but about the boundaries of journalism itself in an era of heightened political tension. Reactions from political figures and media personalities came in waves, some offering fierce defenses of Lemon and condemning the arrest as an unprecedented attack on the First Amendment, while others applauded what they viewed as accountability, arguing that no one should be above the law regardless of profession or status, and this immediate polarization revealed how deeply divided the nation had become, where even the act of enforcing federal statutes could not escape being filtered through ideological lenses, turning a legal event into a symbolic struggle over truth, power, and control of public narrative. As the night wore on and updates continued to trickle in, one truth became impossible to ignore. This was no longer just a story about an arrest or a presidential statement, but a dramatic collision of authority, media influence, and public perception, exposing the fragile balance between law enforcement and press freedom, and setting the stage for a far deeper conflict about who controls the narrative in moments of national crisis, leaving audiences hooked in suspense, desperate for clarity, yet emotionally pulled into a story that promised far-reaching consequences for journalism, politics, and the future of public accountability itself. As dawn approached and the first official court updates began to surface, the tension surrounding Don Lemon's arrest only intensified, with reporters stationed outside federal buildings capturing every movement, every whispered exchange between attorneys and officials, and every subtle shift in body language that hinted at how seriously authorities were treating the case, while inside legal teams worked at lightning speed, reviewing footage, witness accounts, and timelines to determine whether Lemon's presence at the protest was purely journalistic or whether prosecutors could successfully argue that his actions crossed into participation, a question that would soon become the central battlefield in what many were already calling one of the most significant press freedom confrontations in recent years. At the same time, President Trump's comments attacking Alex Prediti continued to ripple through political circles, with supporters interpreting his words as a bold stand against what they viewed as biased media figures, while critics accused him of attempting to influence public perception and indirectly pressure the legal process. And this dual storyline, a journalist in custody and a former president escalating rhetoric, created a dramatic narrative arc where law enforcement actions and political messaging appeared to move in parallel, reinforcing the idea that this moment was as much about power dynamics as it was about legal accountability. Insiders described how federal agencies had been monitoring the protest in Minnesota closely, especially after demonstrators entered a church during a service, an act that authorities viewed as a serious disruption of a protected space. Yet what made Lemon's involvement so controversial was that he had been openly filming and reporting, narrating events as they unfolded, asking questions, and documenting reactions. Behavior that in countless other situations had been praised as frontline journalism, but now was being scrutinized as potential evidence of involvement, showing how quickly the line between observer and participant can blur in emotionally charged environments. Legal experts began appearing across networks, breaking down historical precedents where journalists had been arrested while covering protests or civil unrest, noting that while such cases are rare, they often become landmark moments that redefine press protections, and many pointed out that prosecutors typically hesitate to pursue journalists unless they believe there is clear evidence of unlawful conduct beyond reporting, which fueled speculation about what additional information authorities might be holding, or whether the arrest itself was a strategic move intended to send a broader message about the limits of acceptable behavior in high-profile demonstrations. Meanwhile, public opinion surged like a tidal wave across social media platforms, with hashtags trending within minutes, videos of Lemon at the protest being dissected frame by frame, and users arguing fiercely about whether he appeared to be directing demonstrators, encouraging disruption, or simply documenting chaos as it unfolded, highlighting the modern reality where millions of amateur analysts now participate in shaping narratives, often drawing conclusions long before courts have the chance to weigh evidence, and in doing so, creating pressure that can influence everything from media coverage to political responses. Within political circles, the arrest was viewed not only as a legal matter, but as a strategic moment that could reshape ongoing debates about the media's role in political activism, with some lawmakers calling for stronger protections for journalists working in volatile situations, while others argued that individuals should not be allowed to hide behind the title of reporter if they actively contribute to unlawful actions. And this clash of perspectives reflected a broader national struggle over trust in media institutions and the growing perception that journalism itself has become deeply entangled in political movements. By the end of the day, what had started as breaking news had evolved into a full-scale national controversy, with press freedom organizations issuing statements, political leaders weighing in, and the public watching closely as Don Lemon prepared for his first court appearance, knowing that the outcome would likely extend far beyond one individual, potentially setting precedents that would shape how journalists operate in protest environments for years to come. And as the story continued to unfold, one thing was certain: the collision between federal authority, political rhetoric, and media influence had only just begun, promising even greater revelations and tensions in the days ahead. As Don Lemon finally stepped into the federal courthouse under the watchful eyes of cameras and security officers, the atmosphere felt less like a routine legal proceeding and more like a historic confrontation where every step he took echoed with symbolic weight, and every whispered comment from onlookers hinted at the broader implications this case carried for journalists across the nation, while his legal team moved swiftly beside him, their faces focused and determined, fully aware that this was not simply about defending one man, but about protecting the principles of free reporting that many believed were now under threat. Inside the courtroom, prosecutors laid out their initial argument with carefully chosen words, emphasizing the seriousness of disrupting a place of worship and suggesting that Lemon's presence and actions may have gone beyond observation, framing him as someone who allegedly played a role in enabling or encouraging the protest, while his defense countered just as firmly, describing him as a journalist fulfilling his duty to inform the public, capturing unfolding events in real time, and asserting that punishing reporting itself would create a chilling effect that could discourage journalists from covering important stories in the future. The tension rose as video footage from the protest was referenced, with moments replayed where voices echoed inside the church. Demonstrators spoke passionately about immigration enforcement, and Lemon's camera captured the emotional reactions of both protesters and congregation members, yet interpretations of those same images varied wildly depending on perspective, with some viewing the footage as proof of documentation, while others claimed it showed a level of involvement, underscoring how the same evidence can tell dramatically different stories in the courtroom of public opinion. Outside, crowds gathered, some holding signs in support of Lemon and press freedom, others demanding accountability for disruptions of sacred spaces, and the visual contrast reflected the nation's deep divisions. As chants rose and fell in waves, police maintained barriers, and reporters struggled to interview participants amid the noise, creating a scene that mirrored the chaos and emotion of the original protest itself, as though the conflict had simply relocated from a church in Minnesota to the steps of a federal courthouse. Political commentators quickly connected the dots between President Trump's earlier attacks and the arrest, suggesting that the rhetoric had helped frame the narrative in ways that made such legal actions more acceptable to certain audiences, while others dismissed that idea entirely, insisting the case was purely about enforcing federal law. And this ongoing debate revealed how intertwined politics and justice have become in the modern era, where nearly every high-profile legal case is interpreted through partisan lenses rather than purely legal ones. Behind closed doors, according to insiders familiar with the process, negotiations began almost immediately regarding potential release conditions, future hearings, and evidence disclosure, as both sides prepared for what promised to be a lengthy and highly publicized legal battle, knowing that each filing, motion, and court appearance would be dissected by media outlets and audiences nationwide, turning the case into an ongoing drama rather than a single headline moment. As night fell and updates slowed, viewers were left with more questions than answers about the strength of the evidence, about the motives behind the prosecution, and about what this case would mean for journalists who regularly place themselves in the middle of unfolding events. And with suspense hanging thick in the air, it became clear that this was not a story that would fade quickly, but one that would continue to evolve, challenge assumptions, and test the boundaries of law, media, and political power in ways that could reshape the future of reporting itself. As the case against Don Lemon continued to dominate headlines, the ripple effects began spreading far beyond the courtroom, reaching newsrooms, universities, political offices, and press organizations across the country, where editors quietly reassessed how they would deploy reporters to cover protests and volatile events, fearing that the arrest might signal a shift in how aggressively authorities were willing to pursue journalists who found themselves in the middle of civil demonstrations. And this behind-the-scenes recalibration revealed a growing anxiety within the media industry that the boundaries of protected reporting were becoming increasingly uncertain. Major media outlets devoted hours of airtime to examining every detail of Lemon's career, his outspoken critiques of political figures, and his long history of challenging those in power, with some analysts arguing that his high-profile status made him an easy target in a politically charged environment, while others insisted that fame should not grant immunity from the law. And this intense scrutiny turned his entire professional life into a backdrop for the current controversy, as if every past moment was being reinterpreted to support one narrative or another. President Trump's continued commentary, both through public statements and social media posts, further intensified the situation, as he framed the arrest as evidence that the legal system was finally holding media figures accountable, language that energized his supporters, while alarming critics who feared that such rhetoric could normalize legal pressure against journalists. And the speed at which these messages spread demonstrated how powerful political communication has become in shaping public perception almost instantly, often before legal facts are fully established. Within the legal community, debates erupted over constitutional protections, with scholars citing landmark Supreme Court cases that reinforced the press's right to cover events of public interest, even in chaotic or controversial environments, while others pointed to exceptions where journalists have faced consequences for actions that crossed into unlawful behavior, making it clear that Lemon's case would likely hinge on subtle interpretations of intent, conduct, and responsibility rather than simple definitions of right and wrong. Meanwhile, those who had attended the church service in Minnesota began sharing their own accounts, describing the shock and discomfort of having a sacred moment interrupted by protesters, while others who supported the demonstration spoke about their urgency to draw attention to immigration enforcement practices, and these deeply personal stories added emotional complexity to the legal battle, reminding audiences that beyond political arguments and legal theories were real people whose lives and beliefs had been directly affected by the events that sparked the controversy. As weeks of speculation unfolded, leaks and unofficial reports hinted at internal disagreements among prosecutors regarding the strength of the case, with some allegedly expressing concern about the precedent it could set, while others believed firmly that enforcement was necessary to prevent future disruptions of protected spaces, suggesting that the decision to pursue charges may not have been as straightforward as it initially appeared, but rather the result of intense debate behind closed doors. By this point, the story had evolved into a national referendum on the role of journalism in moments of conflict, the power of political rhetoric to shape legal narratives, and the delicate balance between enforcing laws and protecting freedoms. And as audiences remained glued to updates, waiting for the next twist in the unfolding drama, one thing became increasingly clear. Whatever the final outcome, the arrest of Don Lemon and the political firestorm surrounding it would leave a lasting impact on how media, law enforcement, and political leaders interact in the future, setting the stage for consequences that would reach far beyond a single courtroom. As the nation waited for the legal process to unfold, a deeper realization began settling in among viewers, journalists, and political observers alike that this moment was not simply about whether Don Lemon would face charges or walk free, but about how fragile the balance between authority and accountability had become in an era where every action is magnified, politicized, and weaponized within minutes, and where the boundaries between law enforcement, media responsibility, and political influence are no longer clearly drawn lines, but shifting landscapes shaped by public opinion, pressure, and power. Behind the scenes, conversations continued in quiet offices and conference rooms where editors debated how aggressively to cover protests going forward, lawyers prepared for long constitutional arguments, and political strategists analyzed how the controversy could impact upcoming elections and public trust, revealing how one single arrest had triggered a chain reaction across multiple institutions, each now forced to reconsider their role in a society increasingly defined by confrontation and spectacle. Supporters of Lemon framed him as a symbol of journalistic courage, a man who placed himself in the middle of unfolding history to show the world what was happening in real time, while critics argued that no profession should grant immunity from consequences when laws are broken. And this clash of perspectives exposed a deeper cultural divide, one side prioritizing the protection of freedoms above all else, the other emphasizing order, rules, and accountability, both convinced they were defending the foundation of democracy. President Trump's continued rhetoric ensured that the story never lost momentum, as each comment reignited debates, fueled headlines, and pulled fresh waves of viewers into the drama, demonstrating the extraordinary power of political messaging to shape the emotional tone of national conversations, while also highlighting how easily legal matters can become intertwined with broader political narratives that extend far beyond the facts of any single case. Legal experts warned that regardless of the outcome, the precedent set here could influence future decisions about how journalists operate in high-risk situations, potentially discouraging on-the-ground reporting or redefining what qualifies as protected activity. And these warnings carried weight, reminding audiences that moments like this often quietly reshape systems long after the cameras move on, altering behavior not through laws alone, but through fear, caution, and uncertainty. As updates slowed and the story entered the long phase of legal proceedings, many began reflecting on the broader question this drama had raised. In a world driven by instant outrage and viral moments, can justice remain purely about evidence and law, or has it become inseparable from public perception and political framing? And while there were no easy answers, the conversation itself signaled how profoundly the relationship between media, power, and society has evolved.